Links are pretty much what makes the web what it is. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at different types of links and how you could create them in your HTML page. So the first type of links that we're going to take a look at are internal links. Here I'm looking at the file called links-internal.html, and it's located in the examples lecture 09 folder. And here we have a couple of links we're going to take a look at. Now the way you create links is by specifying an A element with an attribute href, and href stands for hypertext reference. The value of href can either be a relative or an absolute URL. In our case here, since we're discussing internal links, which are links that point to internal web pages of the web application, the links we're showing are all relative URL links. However, we could still have an even absolute URL links as long as they point, again, to the same web application that we're in. Since we're providing no directory information, the browser will assume that same directory.html is a file that lives in the same directory as links-internal.html. It's also a very good idea to always specify a title attribute for the A tag. The title attribute is used by the screen readers that help the visually impaired people get through the web page. The content in between the opening and closing A tags is the content you're going to see in the web page when it is served and on which you're going to be able to click to go to the href that the A tag is configured with. Note the second example of our A tag. In this example, we're surrounding a div tag with our anchor tag. In other words, this div tag is going to be the content of our link on which we're going to be able to click. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like in the browser. Okay, so here's our internal links page, and we have a couple of links. One is says linking to a file in the same directory, and the other one is the div, that's the A tag surrounding the div tag, that says div linking to a file in the same directory. And if we click that, we're going to go to this same-directory.html page, which basically just provides a link back to our original page. What's interesting to note here is that the first link, linking to a file in the same directory, is clearly an inline tag, since it's not forcing itself to go to a new line. But yet, in the second case, div linking to a file in the same directory, we're surrounding the div tag with our A tag. So what's going on here? Are we using a block level element, the div, inside an inline element? Well, turns out things are a little bit more interesting. Let's take a look at the A tag as defined in the W3C specification. If you take a look closely, the A tag is both a flow content and a phrasing content. In other words, to map it back to the HTML4 days, the A tag in the HTML5 is both an inline element and a block level element at the same time. And this is what allows us to take the A tag and surround a div tag inside of it. The authors of the HTML5 specification realized that there are a lot of times where you would like to be able to click on a whole region. And the most common occurrence of that is when you have a logo or some sort of a company name in the top left corner, for example, of your web page. People expect to be able to click on that and be able to go to the front page of the company. Prior to HTML5, people had to use all kinds of tricks in order to achieve that effect because the A tag was only in an inline tag and you weren't really able to wrap the A tag around the div tag. Next, let's take a look at an example of an external link. Here we are in Sublime Text again and looking at the file called links-external.html, which is again located in the examples lecture 09 folder. And this document basically contains just a single link. There's really nothing super special about external links other than that their href value usually starts with http:// because it's usually the case that external links are hosted on a different domain name than your website. However, there's one feature of the A element that I would like to demonstrate that is quite often used in conjunction with external links, and that is the target attribute. Target attribute, when it's set to the value _blank, forces the browser to open this page in a new tab or a new window. The reason that's advantageous is because nowadays, unfortunately, people have a very short attention span, and if you take them from your website to a different website, it is a very good chance that they will never come back to your site. And usually you don't want them to leave your site completely. So target equals underscore blank is very useful in that regard. Let's take a look at this page in the browser. And here's the page in the browser, and if we click this link, Coursera Facebook page, it will open a new tab and will load the Facebook page pointed to by that link. Coincidentally, this is a Facebook page I created for the two courses I'm teaching on Coursera, which is at facebook.com/Coursera webdev. So please like this page and follow it, as I'll be posting some optional but interesting and relevant material. Another type of link that is extremely important to know about is a fragment identifier. So here I'm again in Sublime Text in links same page.html that is located in examples lecture 09 folder. And as you could see, the links that I have set up here all have a very specific format in their href attribute. It's a pound followed by some name, like section 1, section 2, and so on. Now what these links are pointing to is a section of our page. Now you could identify a section a couple of different ways. You can have an any tag that has an ID with that section name. Notice that the section name does not contain the pound sign. Only the link to that section contains the pound sign. That's one way to identify a section within the page. Another way is, if we scroll down all the way to the bottom of the page, is to create an anchor tag with a name attribute and name the section very similarly to the way you name a section ID. The way you refer to these sections is exactly the same. You put a pound in front of the name of the section and stick that value in the href attribute of an anchor tag. So let's take a look at this document in the browser. And here's the document. As you can see, we have 6 different links, and if we click on any one of these links, it will take us to the section of the page that is marked with that particular ID. If we scroll all the way down, we even have a back to the top link, which basically points to all the way to the top. Now, the top is right here, and if we look at the code and scroll all the way up, we have an h1 tag that has an ID with top, which allows us to scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, see that link, and jump right back to the top. What's really neat about fragment identifiers is that if you click on one and you have them in your URL, you could copy and paste this URL and send it to a friend as a bookmark, and when they paste it into their browser, they will be taken to this page and jump straight to the section that was pointed to by the fragment identifier. Now, I am on my local hard drive and I'm not on a server, so obviously sending this link that points to my local hard drive is not going to do any good. But if we're on a server, this link with the section identifier would have taken anybody anywhere with a connection to the internet to the proper page and to the proper section of that page. While fragment identifiers are very useful in order to jump to different parts of the same page, recently they've become even more important as they're used for navigation within the SPA or single page applications. And SPA, single page applications, have become extremely popular, so knowing how fragment identifiers work is an important step towards being able to code single page applications. So to summarize, we learned about internal linking to other pages within the same site, external linking to other web pages, and don't forget the target equals underscore blank, so you could open up the external link in a separate tab. And we also talked about linking to sections of a single document and being able to pass around those type of links to others, that they'll be able to jump straight to the section of the document that you want them to. Next, we're going to talk about displaying images. Perhaps nothing enhances a website better than strategically placed images. In this lecture, we will learn how to include images in your HTML documents. Okay, so we're looking at images.html, which is located in the examples lecture 10 folder. And You may recognize this file from a few lectures ago, where this is a famous quote from Theodore Roosevelt. And by the way, I apologize, I made a typo before. Theodore Roosevelt is spelled with an E, so for you eagle eyes out there who noticed that I misspelled Theodore, I apologize. It was just a typo. Anyway, our task here is to display an image right before the quote itself. And we actually have a couple of images here, and since I want to just start with one, let me comment this one out and at the same time show you what an HTML comment looks like. And it's pretty simple. It starts with a less than bracket, exclamation point, dash dash, and then it gets closed with a dash dash right angle bracket. And what will happen when you load this page into the browser is that the browser will completely ignore this comment and will not render it. So let's take a look at the image tag that we wanted to discuss. The image is displayed in HTML using this img tag, which is just short for image. And the source attribute of the img tag is a URL that points to some image file. Now, this URL is no different than the href attribute that you've seen with the regular link a tag. It could be a relative URL, or it could be an absolute URL, even one that contains an external link. Next, we specify the width and the height of the image. While not absolutely required, it's a really good idea to always specify the width and the height, and I will demonstrate to you in a few minutes why that is. And also the alt tag, which is used by screen readers that help people with visual impairment. Let's save the document and take a look at it in the browser. As you can see, this is the image that we included in our HTML. The interesting part here is it appears as if it's another character within our text, which should right away tell you that an img tag is an inline element. If it weren't, the image would be on its own line, pushing everything behind it onto a new line. Next, let's take a look at the other image tag and uncomment it so we could use it within our page. And as you could see, this is an external link pointing to some image on the web. Let's save the file and preview it in the browser again. Let's reload it. As you can see, we get this image of, I think, ants crawling on a blade of grass. It's very often the case that you use images as sort of these anchors within your visual layout of your page. And if these images take time to load, the page might appear jumpy. So this is actually the primary reason why you would want to use the width and the height of the image. You want to tell the browser to reserve the space and to visually partition your page such that it knows that there should be something going on in there, even if it takes time to load it. So let's simulate what would happen to our layout if we removed the width and the height from this image. Let's go ahead and save it. Go to our web page, and instead of just reloading it, since our internet, or at least my internet, is pretty fast here, I'm going to simulate internet being very slow, and we'll see how the fact that this paragraph and this paragraph is visually separated by this image is not necessarily going to happen right away, and we'll see some jumping. Well, the way we're going to accomplish that is by bringing up the Chrome Developer Tools, and I'm on the Mac, so I'm going to press Option Command I, and if you're in Windows, I believe it's Control Option or Control Alt I, and I'm going to go to the Network tab. And if you notice here, there is a throttling setting here, and it says no throttling. What I'm going to change that to the lowest possible setting. And now I'm going to go ahead and reload the page and watch what happens in terms of this space between the Theodore Roosevelt and the actual quote. So let's go ahead and reload the page. And notice how it jumped. First there was Theodore Roosevelt was right next to the quote, and then once the image loaded, it jumped in. And the reason that happened is because the browser did not upfront know how large the image was going to be. Even worse, if you're relying on the image to give some sort of a visual layout to your page, and for some reason the image did not load. For example, the URL could be broken. So let me go ahead and break it just by removing a couple of letters from the URL. And if URL is broken, this is what you're going to get if you don't specify the width and the height of the image. Let's go back to our page and let's click reload, and there you go. If we relied on a specific amount of space between the quote and the footer of this page, well, we can no longer see that space since the image did not load. However, if we go back and undo this and still break the URL, yet specifying the width and the height of the image, let's go back and reload the page, you'll see that even though the image is not loading, the visual spacing and the visual layout remains correct as we intended it to be. So to summarize, images can truly enhance your website, especially if you use them correctly. And remember to always specify width and height of the image tag whenever possible, because if without it, it may break your layouts. I mentioned before that on the web, content is king. It's all about content. And we spoke about the fact that HTML defines the structure of that content. So if all you wanted was raw content, you could take your HTML files, upload them to a server, and you're done. However, that would be a huge mistake, because while content is king, how users absorb and relate to that content largely depends on our experience of consuming the presentation of it. If there was a lot of noise around me and you could barely hear me, the content of the course would be the same, but the experience consuming the presentation of that content would be quite different. To use the house analogy, nobody likes to live in a house without nicely painted drywall covering insulation and support beams. It's the difference between feeling sheltered from outside elements and feeling at home. The point I'm trying to make is when it comes to a real-world website, structure alone is just not enough. It's not good enough to just leave a scaffolding, a server-side framework provided out of the box to see the data. You need to style your content in a way that's pleasing and useful to the user. The use of color, positioning, size, among other things, is all part of that. Cascading style sheets, or CSS, is the technology that provides the styling capability. CSS is an incredibly powerful technology. It can take the same HTML structure and present it in such drastically different ways that you would never even guess that the underlying structure of the content are exactly the same ones. Let me show you a website that doesn't only illustrate this point, but should also amaze you quite a bit as well. So the website I wanted to show you is csszengarden.com. And the idea of this website is simple. Designers and web developers from all over the world get to submit their own designs for the website csszengarden.com. So they get to redesign the website itself, csszengarden.com. There's only one catch. They cannot change any of the HTML. The HTML stays exactly the same, and the CSS file or files is what they provide. So the only thing they change is the styling. They don't change the structure or the content of the HTML at all in any shape or form. So the website then goes ahead and showcases its designs on csszengarden.com. And they have over 200 designs submitted now and hosted on this website. So what I want to do is just to give you an appreciation of what styling can do to a website, to the same content, to the same HTML structure, is to demo and just basically showcase a couple of these designs to you. So what I did was I pre-opened a few of them in a few tabs in my browser, and I want to show you. So this is the same website. This is the website you're looking at. It's the HTML and custom CSS for this particular look. So let me just scroll up and down to show you what that looks like. And let's go to this one. So this is, again, the exact same website. The only difference is the CSS styling that got applied to it. This is the same website again with different CSS styling applied to it. Now, granted, the designers are also able to apply their imagery as well, but the layout, the styling is so drastically different than from the original one. And there's, again, over 200 different websites or different styles, different designers that submitted different styles. So you could certainly go take a look. And this one is very creative. It's actually made in the form of a comic book or comic, and the text is real. It's selectable. So this is still the same exact HTML. And this one probably will blow you away. Look at this. It's so cool. There's actually animations going on. It's all done with CSS. And again, it's exactly the same HTML structure and exactly the same content. You just see different styles applied to them. Is this neat or what? So the point of this short lecture was that CSS is an incredibly powerful technology that can not only style your content, but also create a particular user experience that you would want your users to have. And the second point was that user experience over your content matters, right? Remember the difference between listening to something that you could barely hear and listening to something that you actually enjoy and can understand. So user experience of content matters. So all that's left is to figure out how to write CSS code. So next, we'll start exploring the syntax of CSS and we'll explore the anatomy of a CSS rule. CSS works by associating rules with HTML elements. These rules govern how the content of specified elements should be displayed. And while styling an entire web page could be a pretty complex process, defining a simple CSS rule is fairly straightforward. So let's go over that. A CSS rule consists of a selector. In this case, it's a P, the paragraph tag, which is basically saying that whatever rules I'm about to give should apply to the content of every single paragraph tag in the entire HTML page. The selector is followed by open and close curly braces. Inside those braces, we have the CSS declaration, and it consists of two parts, the property and the value. Property name is something that's predefined by a CSS specification, and for every property, there's a set number of predefined values. Or in case of numerical values, set number of type of numerical values that is predefined. Now every property and the value is separated by a colon and is terminated by a semicolon. Now, technically speaking, a semicolon is not a requirement, but it's a best practice and you should always use it. Now, as I told you, a CSS rule can consist of several declarations. For example, in this case, we're specifying that the contents of the paragraph tags in our HTML page should have a particular color, a particular font size, and also be a particular width, meaning the paragraph itself, the content, should take up 200 pixels. Now, the collection of these CSS rules is what's called a style sheet. Now, technically speaking, you don't have to have anything in the style sheet to be called a style sheet. An empty style sheet, it technically is a style sheet as well, but it's just not a very useful one. So obviously, you would probably have at least one CSS rule in there, but typically you have way more than just one. Okay, here I am in Sublime Text, and I'm looking at a file called css-syntax.html, and it's located in the examples lecture 12 folder. Let me give you a quick rundown of the structure of the HTML that we have. So in this HTML document, we have a heading, H1, a couple of H2s, and a couple of paragraphs in between, signified by the P paragraph tag. And what we want to do is give these elements some custom styling. So I'm going to place the styling, our style sheet, straight in the head section of our HTML document. Now, in later lecture, we'll talk about where CSS styles should really go for a real-world website, but for now, for convenience sake, we'll just put it straight in the head part of the document. So here we see a paragraph tag that's being targeted, and we're going to change its color to blue, font size to 20, and width 200, which means it will contain an area of the screen that's 200 pixels wide. Our heading 1 tag, H1, we're going to give it a color of green. We'll bump up its font size a little bit, and we'll also tell it to align itself in the middle of the screen. So let's take a look at what this page looks like in the browser. As you can see, our H1 tag is in the middle of the screen and it's green, and the two paragraphs that we have are blue and only take up around 200 pixels. And already right away you could see the power of CSS. We only specified the paragraph tag once, and yet every paragraph in the document is styled exactly the same. So it affords us consistency and also efficiency in writing CSS code. Now, I do want to point out one quick but important thing. If you take a look at this subheading 1 and then subheading 2, you can see that it is bold and it's a little bit bigger than the regular text would be. Now, where did that style come from? I certainly never specified what kind of styling to apply to essentially what is an H2 tag. Well, that styling came from the browser itself. Every browser comes with some default styles that it applies to different HTML elements. And H1, H2, and so on, and different other elements are very commonly styled by the browser itself. So a lot of times it's your job to really reset or override these styles and put the styles in that you would like your web page to have. So to summarize, we went over the syntax of a CSS rule. We talked about the selector part, the declaration part, and the property value pair. We also talked about combining these CSS rules into one to create a style sheet. Next, we're going to zero in on one part of the CSS rule declaration, and that is the selector. We're going to talk about different types of selectors, in particular, element, class, and ID selectors. CSS selectors are used to determine which HTML element or set of elements to apply the CSS declarations to. The browser uses its selector API to traverse the DOM or document object model and pick out the elements matching the selector. Now, crafting a selector is a great skill to have, and not only for styling using CSS. That's because a lot of JavaScript libraries out there use the browser's selector API to attach behavior and data to HTML elements, much in the same way that CSS applies style to those elements. In this lecture, we're going to talk about three different types of selectors: element, class, and ID selector. First, the element selector. The element selector is just you specifying the element name. For example, in this case, P for paragraph says that every paragraph in our HTML document should be colored blue. As an example, if we specified P paragraph and color blue, that means every paragraph in the HTML document will have its contents text be blue. Obviously, this doesn't really affect any other elements that contain text in them. For example, we can have a div element that contains text, but that text will not be affected by our CSS rule that specifies that the paragraph tag should have content text colored blue. Next is the class selector, and the class selector is specified with a dot and the name of the class. In this case, again, we're creating a blue class, a blue CSS class that will color whatever it targets with the color blue. The class selector does require a little bit of a change to your HTML document in that each element that you want that class applied to has to have an attribute class equal to the class name. So in this case, we have a P, the paragraph tag, and the div tag both have the attribute class equals blue, and therefore their content or their text content will be colored blue. Notice that a different paragraph that is not marked with attribute class equals blue is completely unaffected by this. Note the difference in between the way you define a class and the way you use the class. You define the class always with a dot in front of the name. There cannot be any space between the dot and the name of the class, in case no space between the dot and the word blue. However, when you use the class, you don't use the dot in its name. You just use its name. So here we have the paragraph tag with class equals blue without the dot in front of it. The last type of selector we're going to take a look at in this lecture is the ID selector. The way you specify an ID selector is by specifying the value of an ID of an element within your HTML document preceded by a pound sign. So the name is a value of some ID within our HTML document. So for example, if you have a div with an ID equals name, and then you specify your CSS rule with a selector $name, the CSS declarations for that $name will apply to the content of the div element with its ID value name. Note that obviously everything else in the HTML document is completely unaffected by this. Similarly, in the way you define a class selector versus use a class selector, the ID selector is defined with a $, followed by the value of an ID within your HTML document. And again, you cannot have any space between the two. But when you use it, the pound goes away. It's just the actual value of the ID itself. Now, in order to write more efficient rules, CSS allows us to group several selectors into one CSS rule. Here we have two selectors grouped together, div and the selector div for the div element and the selector class blue grouped into one since they both share the same CSS declaration. And you could see in our HTML, the blue colored text will appear in the paragraph tag that has the attribute class equals to blue and in any div tag in the HTML document. So let's take a look at an example of using these selectors. Okay, so here I am in Sublime Text, and I'm looking at the file simple selectors before.html, and it's located in the examples lecture 13 folder. Let me go ahead and reveal the browser, and we'll even close the sidebar so we could see the browser and the code at the same time. So let's scroll down and take a look at what our HTML structure is like. So if you take a look at the left side of the screen, which is the Sublime Text, and the right side of the screen, you could see that we have the H1 tag right here, which is this heading. We have a couple of H2 headings, which are called subheading 1, subheading 2. We have a few paragraphs. A couple of those paragraphs have a class attribute set to highlight. And the last thing here on the page, we have a div that has a span inside of it with an ID attribute equal main point. So let's go ahead and scroll up and take a look as to what we'd like to do here. So first of all, we want all H2 elements to be color red and aligned in the center. So in order to do that, we have to substitute these XXX with some sort of selector. Well, this is very easy. That's just the H2 element selector. That's all it is. So once we do that and we save it and refresh our browser, we could see that both H2 headings became red and centered. Next, we want to affect every single element that has an attribute whose class is equal highlight. Well, in order to do that, we have to define the highlight class. And so what we're going to do here is apply a bigger font size. We'll make it bold, italic. The background of the entire element should turn green. And also, we're going to turn that opacity down a little bit from 1 would be 100%, and 0.6 is 60%. So the way we define a class selector is by saying dot highlight, and here's our class selector. Notice there's no space between the dot and the highlight. So if we go ahead and refresh, so we have two paragraphs here that had their styles affected by that, and that is because if you scroll down, we have a couple of paragraphs both with class equals highlight. Next, let's see, we need to have the element with ID equal main point. So the way we specify an ID selector is by saying # and the name of the ID, which is main point. And the upper and lowercase letters here do matter. And again, there's no space between the # and the word main point. So if we go ahead, come over here and refresh, we could see that the span that surrounded the words ID equals main point became red, and it became a little bit of a bigger font size, and opacity is turned down, and the font is bold. Last, we wanted to take all elements that are P and elements H1, and we want to group their style such that we don't have to specify them separately. So the way we do that is very simply by saying P, H1. So we grouped the styles for the P element and the H1 element into one. So every P element now and every H1 element should now turn its color to blue and align center. So we're going to go ahead and save this document, refresh the browser. And here we go. Every P element and every H1, which there's only one here, turned blue and aligned in the center. So one thing to notice here is that out of all the selectors, the element selector, the class selector, and the ID selector, the ID is the least reusable one. And that makes sense, right? Since by HTML rules, a particular ID attribute value can only appear once in the document. So for example, the span with ID attribute equals to main point, I can't really reuse the value main point as an ID for any other element in this HTML document. So as you plan your styles, it's good to keep this in mind and not basically rely on assigning IDs to every single element in the entire HTML document, because that way your CSS will not be very efficient. You will have to write specific rules for every element, and you won't really be able to generalize and reuse your CSS styles very easily. In summary, we spoke about the syntax of simple CSS selectors. We spoke about the element selector, the class selector that you remember to define with a dot right in front of the name without the space, and the ID selector that you define with a pound sign right before the value of the ID in the HTML page, again without the space in between. Next, we're going to talk about combining selectors to create a more targeted selection within the document object model. Combining selectors is a very powerful technique that allows you to more precisely target DOM elements. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at some of the most common ways of combining CSS selectors. The first one is element with class selector. As you can see here, we have a p element followed immediately without any spaces by a .big, which is a class selector. And what this expresses is that I want to target every p element that has an attribute class equal to big. Note the lack of space between the element and the class definition. If you do put a space, it will mean a completely different combination, so make sure that if you want an element that has a class assigned to a particular value, that there's no spaces between the first selector and the second selector, in this case between the p element selector and the .big class selector. And as an example, here you could see on the right that p with a class equals big will get the text size 20 pixels, as opposed to all the other elements that have a class equal to big will not get that same 20 pixel font size styling. This technique is pretty commonly used when you have a CSS class definition that applies to different elements, but when it's applied to a particular element, you would like the styling to slightly change. Next type of combination of selectors is a child selector, and its syntax is pretty straightforward. It's a selector followed by a right angle bracket followed by another selector. And the way you read these combinations is from right to left. And in this case, what we're trying to do is target every p element that is a direct child of an article element. So in this example, you could see that the p element that is a direct child of an article element will get the styling of color blue applied to it, as opposed to a regular p element that will obviously be unaffected, but also a p element that is inside an article element, but not a direct child of it. So there's a div element that's contained within the article element, and only then is the p element contained within the div. So since the p element is not a direct child of the article in the second case, its font styling is unaffected. Another type of selector is a descendant selector, and the syntax of it is selector space another selector. And just like before, you read it from right to left. So in this case, what we're trying to do is target every p element that is inside at any level of an article element, which means that even if it's not a direct child, or even if it's deep down, as long as one of its parents in its ancestry is an article, this rule will apply. So for example, in this case, it is a direct child of an article and the text will turn blue. In this case, it's going to be completely unaffected because it's not inside of an article element altogether. And in this case, it will still turn blue, that even though it's not a direct child of the element, since we're using a descendant selector combination, the p element is still technically inside the article, even though it's not a direct child, and will have its text turn blue. Now, I want to point out that these selector combinations aren't limited to element selectors, even though that's what I've used in the examples. So for example, we can have a .colored space p, and that will mean, again, reading it from right to left, that every p element that is inside at any level of an element with class equals colored will have its text color turn to blue. In the case of on the right, we're using a direct child selector to say that every element with the attribute class equal to colored that is direct child of an article element will have its text turn to blue. Let's take a look at a few coding examples to see these combinations in action. Okay, so I'm in Sublime Text and I'm looking at a file called element with class before.html, and it's located in the examples lecture 14 folder. Let me quickly rearrange the screen so you could see the browser and the code editor better. Okay, so you can see we have a pretty simple HTML document. Let's take a look at its structure. We have an h1 tag whose class is highlight. We have a couple of paragraph tags, One just a regular paragraph tag, and another one has a class highlight applied to it. And we have a div tag that has actually two classes applied to it called main point and highlight. And notice the way you apply multiple classes to an element is just by listing them in the class attribute with a space between them. Okay, so let's go ahead and write some selector rules. So the first one we want to do is we want to target everything with class highlight. Well, that's very easy. We've done that before. That's just dot highlight. We'll save that and we'll preview the difference in the browser, and we see that everything with a class highlight does in fact have the background color turned to green. Next, we'll look at all p elements with class highlight. Well, we've done this before, so we need to do all p element, but we can't put a space. We'll just have to put dot highlight right after that, which will mean all p elements that have a class highlight assigned to them, and we want to turn them into italic. So let's save that and refresh the browser, and we could see that the p element that has a class equal to highlight did in fact turn italic. Next, we'll combine two class elements. In this case, we want all the elements with class highlight as well as with class main point. If both of those classes get applied to the same element, we want that element to turn red and its background color to turn black. So the way we could specify that is just to say dot highlight dot main point. That is to say that an element that has highlight class and also has a main point class assigned to it should be colored red and background black. Let's go and refresh this, and sure enough, the last element on the page, the div that has both classes assigned to it, has its styling affected in the way we want it. Next, let's take a look at the file called child selector before.html. Let's go ahead and quickly examine its HTML structure. It has a couple of section tags. The first section tag has an h2 tag called subheading 1, a div tag, and inside the div tag we have the article tag. In the second section, we have an article tag that is a direct child of this section tag. And the subheading 2, which is an h2 element, is sitting outside of the section tag altogether. So let's take a look as to what we need to do here. In the first rule, we want to target any article element which is a direct child of a section element. In other words, any article element whose immediate parent is a section element. Well, we've done this before in examples. So that's section with a right angle bracket to say immediate child, and its immediate child should be article. So we save that and refresh the browser. We see that the styling is only applied to the article that is direct child of the section, but the article that is not direct child of the section sitting inside the div is unaffected. The next target is any h2 element which is a direct child of a section element. In other words, any h2 element whose immediate parent is a section element. So again, the idea is similar. It's section and its direct child should be h2. So any h2 that is a direct child of a section element. Let's save that and refresh. And since subheading 1 is a direct child of the section element, that is the only element that gets our styling rule applied to it. Next, let's take a look at the file called descendant selector before.html. Let's quickly examine its HTML structure. We have a couple of unordered lists here. The first unordered list is sitting inside the section element, and the second unordered list is sitting inside the article element. So let's take a look at our CSS rule. What we want to do is we want to target all li elements that are inside of a section element. That is, no matter how deep they are in the element tree underneath the section element, we want the style of color green applied to it. So that sounds like we need to use a descendant selector, and the way we do that is to say section, space, and li. And as you can see, this selector combination should target this first list. And even though ul separates the li elements from the section element, the style should still apply since we used a descendant selector combination. So let's go ahead and refresh the browser, and you can see that all the li elements of the first list turn green just as we expected. So to summarize, we looked at different ways of combining selectors. We looked at element with class selector, which is a selector without a space followed by a class definition. We look at child direct selector, which is a selector with an angle bracket followed by another selector. And we looked at a descendant selector, which is a selector with a space followed by another selector. And notice that I'm using the word selector, not necessarily element, just to remind you that it doesn't have to be an element. It could be any selector that is used in a combination with another selector. There are a couple of combination selectors that we did not cover. For example, one is adjacent selector and another one is general sibling selector. Now these selector combinations are a little bit less common than the other ones that I showed you, so I'll leave it up to you to look it up in the specification or online as to how they work. Next, we're going to talk about pseudoclass selectors. Pseudoclass selectors address targeting of either structures that can be targeted by simple combinations of regular selectors or targeting the ability to style based on user interaction with the page. For example, we would want the styling of an element to change if the user hovers or moves their mouse over that element. The way you specify a pseudoclass selector is by specifying some selector that we already know about with a colon and a predefined pseudoclass name. Now, there are many pseudoclass selectors that exist. In this lecture, we're going to cover 5 of them. The first 4, link, visited, hover, and active, are pretty basic and is used very, very often. The last pseudoclass we'll cover, nth child, is a fairly powerful pseudoclass and can get pretty complicated, but its basic uses are fairly straightforward, as we'll see. So let's jump in straight into the code and see how these selectors work. Okay, so in Sublime Text, I'm looking at the file called pseudoselectors before.html that is located in the examples lecture 15 folder. And let me show you what this HTML page looks like in the browser. So this page has a header, and in the header we have an unordered list which has a bunch of links. As you can see, it's showing up as a regular list with bulleted points, followed by a section which has a whole bunch of divs, and each one is named div 1, div 2, div 3, all the way to div 20. And the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to style this unordered list as a menu. It's a pretty common practice to take an unordered list and style it as a menu. So let's go ahead and take this unordered list and style it as a bunch of menu buttons. The first thing we want to do is target these list items. So the way we're going to do this is by using our descendant selector by saying header, li, and we'll turn off the bullet points by saying list style none. And if we refresh the page, we now see that the bullet points went away. The next task is to style the links that are sitting inside the li elements and to make them look like buttons. However, styling links is not exactly as straightforward as styling a regular element, and that's because links have states, and these states can be expressed using our pseudoclasses. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we're targeting 2 states. One is A is being a link that it is, and another one A visited. And this is very often the practice that you group together these two. And what basically that means is, well, link is the way it is, link, and visited means that HTML allows that after you click a particular link that a different style can be applied to that link than an unclicked link. In our case, however, we don't want to differentiate between the two, so we'll style them both together. Okay, so let's start by removing the underline that is the default styling for every link. Once we save that and refresh, we see that the underline is gone. Okay, so let's add some other styles. We'll set the background color to green, border 1 pixel, width solid, meaning solid versus dashed or something like that, and blue, and we'll set the color of the text inside these links to black. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. And here we see we have a blue border, it's a green background, and the color is black. Now, I spoke to you before about the fact that the A element is both sort of an inline element and a block level element. However, that's only as far as inclusion of other elements inside of it is concerned. As far as its default display, it's actually displayed as an inline element. Well, we don't want that for our buttons. We want them to be block level element. Well, I could change that very quickly by just saying display block. And once I say display block and refresh, you could see that the block level elements do what they always do, try to fill up all the space they possibly can within that line. So I'm going to have to constrain that a little bit. Let's go ahead and give it a width of 200 pixels. We don't want our button to be that wide. And we want our line of menu items to be center. And we'll also separate the different menu buttons from each other by giving it a margin bottom of 1 pixel. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And now we see we have 3 little nice buttons in our menu. However, we're not done, because what we would like to do is on the user hovering over these buttons, besides changing the cursor to a pointer, I'd like to have some sort of interaction in the style and kind of show the user that they're hovering over these buttons. So in order to do that, I have to define two more states of the link. One is a hover and the other one a active. Now hover is exactly what it sounds like. Is when the user hovers over the element, in this case the A element. And active is that state when the user actually clicks on the element but hasn't yet released his click. So he presses the mouse button down but hasn't yet released the button. In our case, we don't want to differentiate between the hover and active, so we'll keep them grouped together. Let's set the background color to red and the color of the text to purple. We'll save it and preview it in our browser. So now when I roll over, you could see that the color of the background changes to red and the color of the font is changing to purple, even though in combination with red, it's kind of actually looking blue. Now these buttons still retain their link behavior, so if I click on this link, I will go to the Facebook page. That happens to be the fan page that I created specifically for the courses that I'm teaching on Coursera, which is this course and the next one, which is on AngularJS. As a side note, please go to this page and like it. You'll be able to follow the latest updates, and I'll be posting some optional material that might be interesting to you that's related to web development. And please sign up for the mailing list that I'll be able to notify you when some new interesting material comes out. Obviously, all this is completely optional. In its simplest form, the nth child pseudo-selector allows you to target a particular element within a list. For example, I'd like to target this Facebook fan page link, and I'd like to make it bigger just so you remember to click on it and like the page. So let's take a look at the HTML where it's located. It's located in the header section, and there's a UL, and there's 3 li elements in here. The Facebook link is the third one in the list. So I could go over to my style, and I could say that I want to target the li element that is inside the header element, and I want it to be nth child number 3. So that's the third link. And now I could target and say, for example, font size to be 24 pixels. So I'll make it a little bit larger. So if I refresh the page, you'll see that only the third link, the third menu button, became bigger. The rest of them stayed exactly the same. But the nth child pseudo-selector can do much more fun stuff than that. For example, we have a list of divs here that looks pretty dull. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to make it look like a list. And what I want is that every odd member of this list should get its background color to be gray. So the way I could achieve that is by targeting the div inside the section, and I'll specify the nth child again. And instead of specifying the numbers, 1, 3, and so on, I could specify odd. And if I do that and say background color gray and refresh my page, all of a sudden I have a list that looks looking much easier to read than before. And by the way, just like regular selectors can be combined, pseudo-selectors can be combined as well. For example, if I would like to have the fourth element in this list have a different hover behavior, since right now nothing really changes when I hover over the fourth element in the list, I'd like to have that change. So let's go ahead and target again section div and target the nth child. This time I want the fourth child to be targeted, but I want to specify that its hover behavior should be different. So I'm going to target the hover behavior part, and I'm going to change its background color to green and its cursor to pointer. So let's go ahead and refresh the page. And now when I hover over number 4, the cursor turns to the pointer and the background of that element turns green. I'm sure by now you see how powerful selectors can be, especially using the pseudo-class selectors. One quick word of warning though. Make sure your selector is still readable. These things can get very complicated very quickly, and if you make it such that other developers and you in a month or so can't really understand fairly easily what you're targeting, this can become a bit of a maintenance nightmare. So simple and readable is definitely preferred to complicated and tricky. You might be able to impress people with it, but it's certainly not very good coding practice to make this super complicated. Next, we're going to talk about where do we place the CSS styles, what is the best place to place it, and what the differences between those places are.